They called it a debt. She called it a betrayal. The night her own sisters chained her wrists and handed her over like cargo, Elara Voss had nothing left. No name, no home, no shoes on her feet. She was brought into the throne room of the most powerful Alpha King in the realm, shackled, barefoot, expecting to be claimed like property. But then the king stepped out of that doorway and stopped. Not at her chains, not at her sisters. At the sound barely leaving her lips, a song she hadn't even known she was humming, a melody so old it had no name. His eyes found hers across that cold stone corridor, and something shifted in his face that had no business being there. He ordered the iron removed. He walked her into the hall himself. Why would a king who had every reason to treat her as a transaction choose, in that single moment, to treat her as something else entirely? Watch till the end, because the truth buried in that corridor will change everything you think you know about this story. The iron was cold. Elara Voss had not expected that. Or perhaps she had simply stopped noticing the cold, the way one stopped noticing hunger after the third day. The shackles around her wrists were old, the kind used for livestock transport, and the left ring had a seam that bit into her pulse point each time the guard's rope pulled taut. She counted her steps to avoid thinking about it. 43 since the outer gate. 51. 57. The corridor of Ashenvale keeps stretched ahead like the inside of a throat. Stone walls sweating with winter moisture. Torches spaced too far apart to offer warmth, only enough to throw shadows large as men against the floor. Her feet were bare. She had been wearing shoes when they left Thornvale 2 days ago. She did not know exactly when she had lost them. Behind her, Seraphine walked at a distance that said I am not with her. The distance of a merchant walking behind their shipment. Elara did not look back. She focused instead on the end of the corridor, where a set of carved doors stood shut against the muffled sound of voices. A large gathering, formal, something already in session. They were bringing her into the middle of a court proceeding. She understood the calculation. Less theater, more transaction. Get it over with while the hall was full, witnesses on record, numbers written in ledgers in someone's careful hand. She could feel the shake beginning in her fingers. It was not cold. Her body knew the difference. She had learned, as a child, what to do when the shaking began. Her mother had taught her, or so she was told. She had been 3 when her mother disappeared, had only the ghost of the habit left behind. When frightened, her mouth would move. Not loudly. Not even consciously most of the time. Just a thread of sound caught between the back of her teeth, a melody too old to have a name, moving through her chest like a hand pressed flat against a door to hold it shut. She was doing it now. She did not realize. The sound didn't reach her own ears, only her throat, only the bones of her sternum vibrating with something that was not quite a song, not quite a prayer. The guard in front reached for the door handle. The door opened inward, not from the guard's push, but from inside. A man stood in the frame. He was not what she had assembled in her mind over 2 days of riding. No crown, no robes of state, no studied indifference of power sitting on a throne above supplicants. He was dressed like someone who had been working. Dark linen, unlaced at the throat, a half-undone leather brace on his left forearm. Taller than the door frame wanted him to be. He had braced one hand on the frame above his head, and that unconscious posture, easy, certain, made the space around him compress. His eyes found her before she finished raising her own gaze. The color of them stopped the thread of sound in her throat. She had seen gray eyes before. These were the gray of a frozen lake just before it breaks, deep silver, almost colorless, and entirely awake. Not the eyes of a man who had stepped out of a court session because he was bored. not the eyes of a buyer praising a purchase. Something moved in them. The hall behind him had gone utterly still. She could feel it the way you felt weather before it arrived. A change in pressure, 200 people holding breath at once. He did not look at Seraphine. He did not look at the guard. His gaze held her with a specificity that made her stomach go still the way it had on the morning she found her father in the cellar, knowing before she knew. Well, the word didn't leave his mouth, but she heard it anyway. You were humming, he said. His voice was low, not performed low, genuinely, constitutionally low, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. Elara blinked. I wasn't. A pause, one full breath. His eyes did not move from hers. I heard you. She had nothing to say to that. The shackle seam pressed into her pulse. He stepped out of the doorway, not toward her, just out into the corridor, letting the door swing half shut behind him. He looked at her wrists. Just once, very briefly, the way someone looked at damage they intended to address. Remove them. He said it to the guard without looking at the guard. Your Majesty, by proper ceremony, the formal Lil. His gaze moved to the guard. The guard removed the shackles. The iron dropped against the stone floor, with a sound like a sentence ending. The cold ring of it echoed down the corridor and died. Elara held her own wrists against her stomach, not because they hurt. They did. The left one was already red and warm, but because the absence of weight felt stranger than the weight had. He was watching her hands. His face did not change, but there was something in the stillness of it that was the opposite of indifference. Then he looked up. Come into the hall with me. She should have said yes, Your Majesty. She should have lowered her gaze and followed. Everything about the last 48 hours had been a lesson in what she was allowed to say, how much space her body was permitted to occupy. Why? The word came out before she could choose it. The corridor held its breath. Behind her, she felt Seraphine go rigid. The man in front of her, the King of Ironmere, the Alpha of Ashenvale, the man who had just dropped her shackles on the floor, looked at her with an expression she could not read. Something shifted in his jaw. He was not offended. He was, the only word she could locate, surprised, as if the question had arrived from a direction he hadn't been watching. Because the hall is waiting for me, he said, and I would rather walk in with you beside me than have you brought in behind me. Not an order. Not a request. She turned the sentence over once and found nothing in it that smelled like a trap. She placed her hand on his arm. His forearm was solid beneath her palm, warm even through the linen, the unconscious warmth of someone with a high body temperature or someone who ran closer to the surface than most. She could feel his heart beat through the leather brace. Steady. Towel. Slightly too fast. He opened the door. The great hall of Ashenvale was lit with 100 candles and smelled of pine resin and old stone. Lords and stewards lined the walls. A dispute with some western landholder had been interrupted mid-sentence, the man still standing with his mouth slightly open. Gareth, she would learn his name later, stood near the dais with the expression of a man who had stopped expecting anything and been surprised anyway. The king walked her to the center of the hall and stopped. The debt of House Voss to the crown of Ironmere, he said, addressing the room without raising his voice, is paid in full as of this evening. This woman travels hereafter under the personal protection of the Iron Throne. She is a guest of this house. He paused. If anyone speaks of her otherwise, they will have occasion to regret it. Seraphine's voice came from the doorway, polished and sharp. Your Majesty, by right of law. Lady Voss. Gareth stepped smoothly into the path of whatever she'd been about to say. The king has spoken. The hall resumed breathing. Elara stood in the center of it, and felt the sensation of being very far from the person she'd been 48 hours ago, as if that woman had been left at the Thornvale gate, and someone else had made this walk down the corridor. She noticed the scar later. It was small, barely visible in the candlelight, on his left eyebrow, a pale seam in the dark hair there. A very old wound, healed clean, but not perfectly. The kind left by something sharp, something that had needed to be removed. She didn't know why it made her feel the way a half-remembered word felt, right at the edge of recall. He walked her to the door at the far end of the hall, stopped, and spoke only to her. "Do you remember me?" The scar, the grey eyes, the specific, careful quality of his attention, as if she were something he had been looking for, specifically, for a long time. "No," she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not disappointment, something slower, more patient. "It's all right. There's time." She was already turning toward the door when he spoke again, quiet enough that only she could hear. "That night, you sang over me until morning. You didn't know who I was. You only knew I was dying. And you decided that wasn't acceptable." A pause. "I haven't been able to forget that. 7 years. She stopped in the doorway, did not turn around. Her hand rested on the stone frame. "What song was it?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. She heard him shift behind her, a slight change in the air. When he spoke, his voice was warmer by half a register, the kind of warmth that meant something had been set down. "You don't remember, but I remember all of it." She found the letter 3 hours later in the bottom of her travel sack. She had been sitting on the floor of the tower room, a proper room, with a real window and a bolt she could throw herself, trying to make sense of the last 2 days, with the dispassion of someone, accounting a ledger. Ghost had arrived without explanation or invitation, pushing open the door with a white-grey shoulder, and then sitting down in front of the fire, with the attitude of something that had always been there. She had not objected. The warmth of another body in the room, even a very small one, was a form of argument against complete despair. The sack held almost nothing worth keeping. A change of clothes, her mother's comb, a small book on the weather patterns of the Northern Reaches, which had belonged to her tutor Edmund and had been left behind accidentally. And then, tucked beneath all of it, folded so carefully it had formed a crease through itself, a square of grey paper no larger than her palm. She didn't recognize the fold. She turned it over. On the back, drawn in a hand she knew, before she could have said how, was a set of small symbols, the kind she and Isolde had invented at ages 8 and 10, sitting in the kitchen loft while Seraphine and Rowena studied etiquette downstairs. A private alphabet. 14 letters that stood for nothing in any real tongue. Her hands started shaking before she translated the first word. "Elara?" She set Ghost off her lap and crossed to the writing desk. She found a blank page. She began. The translation was slow. She had to reverse engineer symbols she hadn't used in years, backtrack, erase with her thumbnail, start again. Ghost watched her from the hearthrug with the steady attention of something that understood patience. Outside, the wind hit the tower window and then moved on. When she finished, she read it once, then again, then a third time, because she was looking for the part where it meant something other than what it said. "Elara, don't come home. Don't trust any promise about bringing you back. Trust your eyes more than your ears. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." 3 apologies, the symbols slightly uneven the way. Isolde's writing went when she was crying. Elara held the paper for a long moment. Ghost got up from the hearthrug, and walked over and pressed his forehead against her sternum, a firm, deliberate pressure, and exhaled slowly. She burned both pages in the fire. Then she sat on the floor, with her back against the stone wall, and thought about Isolde, 16, thin-shouldered, standing in the stable yard in the dark with her face turned away. Not saying goodbye because a goodbye would have required telling the truth about what was happening. Pressing a folded square into the bottom of a sack with hands that were probably shaking too. One person, she thought. Only one. She did not cry. She was too tired, and the tower room was too warm, and Ghost was breathing against her collarbone with a rhythm that pulled at her own breathing until they matched. She simply sat and held the warmth of the fire and thought about the sound of her own voice in a dark corridor. A song she hadn't known she was singing, heard by someone she hadn't known, was listening. 3 years before the corridor. The bedroom in Thornvale was dark, except for the single candle she'd been allowed, and her father's voice was very thin. Lord Edric Voss had not been a large man, even in good health. In the last months he had become careful in his movements, careful in his words, careful in the way he chose which rooms to enter and which corridors to walk. Elara had not understood it then, as the behavior of a man who suspected he was being poisoned. She had understood it only as a man growing old, and had tried not to let the fear show on her face when she visited him. Tonight, he had sent for her. He was sitting up in bed when she arrived, which she took as a good sign, and then she saw his hands, and she stopped. "Sit down, little falcon." She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hands in hers. The skin was very loose. The tremor in the left hand was new, since last week. "Your mother," he said, had a voice that could stop rain. She had learned not to interrupt when he spoke about her mother. The memories came infrequently and always unannounced. Her people were called Vale Singers, old blood, old gift. The North remembers them even if the South has forgotten. He paused to breathe. "She left me that gift in you. I should have taught you what it was. I was afraid." His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I was a coward about a great many things." "Father Yon." "Listen, Aya." The word was gentle, but clear. "I don't have many evenings left that make sense. I need to spend this one well." He told her about her mother, Lyanna. Not the absence of her, not the shape of the grief, but the actual woman. The way she had hummed while she worked. The way that humming had once slowed a runaway cart. The way she had woken Elara from a fever on the night of her 2nd birthday with a single drawn note that dropped the temperature in the room by degrees. "The voice is a key," Lyanna had told him once. "The world is mostly locked. You just have to find the right door." He told her about the dwindling money. He told her about the keg of wine 3 weeks ago with the strange sweetness, which he'd left untouched, and then had gone back to find empty. He told her he'd been sleeping in the cellar library. "Seraphine," he said. Not a question. Elara held very still. She sold the Eastern deposits to a banker in Varental 6 months ago. The Ironmere debt, the timber agreement, was small. She let it sit on purpose. His voice was getting harder to follow. She leaned closer. "She'll use it to move you." "Move me to where?" He looked at her for a long moment, with eyes that were still, even now, the sharpest thing in the room. "Somewhere she can't see you outshine her anymore." He squeezed her hands once. "You have your mother's voice, Elara. Find Marin. Tell her who you are. She'll know what to do with it." 3 days later, he was gone. The shackles came on the 2nd night of the journey north, when the road was dark and the guards had changed to Seraphine's men. She had said it was ceremony, an old custom of house-to-house transfer. Her voice had been perfectly level, her eyes somewhere slightly past Elara's left ear. Rowena had not looked up from her horse's mane. Isolde had been standing by the stable wall. When the iron was brought out, she had not moved. She had not spoken. But in the very last moment, before Elara's hands were taken, Elara had felt her sister's eyes on the side of her face, a look that pressed like a held breath. The shackles went on. The road continued north. Elara had not slept that night. She had lain in the wagon and counted the stars through the canvas gap, and thought about the scar on Edric Voss's hands, and the way old iron smelled in winter, and the name Moraine, which her father had given her like a key pressed into a palm. She had not thought about the song. She had not known then that a king had been holding on to it for 7 years. The old woman found Elara on the 4th morning, before Elara had found her. She appeared in the tower room doorway with a tray that held 2 cups, and a piece of dark bread, and an expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific knock, and had simply decided to go answer the door herself rather than wait further. Short, white-haired, with the kind of hands that had done real work for decades, knuckled and quick, the left index finger bent at a permanent angle. "Eat first," she said, setting the tray down. "I'll answer questions after." Ghost, on the hearthrug, thumped his tail once without opening his eyes. Her name was Maren. She had served at Ashenvale since before Caelan's mother died, and before that she had travelled, broadly, and apparently with intention. She knew about Vale singers the way a carpenter knew about wood grain, not academically, but because she had worked with it, had seen what it could do and what it could cost. "Your mother," she said, when Elara had eaten, "was the last practicing Vale singer I met, Loana. I treated her for a joint illness in a cottage south of the Ironway Road. She was very young, very strong. She poured a second cup of something that steamed and smelled of bark and pine. I didn't know she'd had children." Elara held her cup with both hands. "She left when I was 3. "I know. She was running from something." Maren's voice did not soften the way adults' voices usually softened around this subject. Elara found she preferred it. "The gift is in the voice. You already know that. You've been using it without knowing what it was your entire life. Slowing things, calming things." She looked at Elara steadily. "Keeping men alive through fever." The cup was warm against Elara's palms. "The voice is a key," Elara said. Maren went still. "Where did you hear that?" "My father," he said my mother told him. For a moment, Maren looked at the fire with an expression that sat in the lines of her face, the way water sat in stone. Absorbed, invisible, until the light hit it exactly right. Then she stood. "Come with me. I want to show you something." The castle had a small chapel that no one used, tucked into a north wing, 2 narrow windows, a floor of pale stone worn smooth in the center from some old irregular use. It smelled of cold stone and faintly, very faintly, of something that burned sweet, as if incense had lived there long enough to leave a ghost in the walls. Maren sat down on one of the stone ledges and said, simply, "Hum." Elara felt the heat rise in her face. "I don't. It's not something I do on purpose." "Then do it on accident, the way you've been doing it your whole life. Don't think about it." Maren folded her hands in her lap with the patience of someone who had been waiting years and found a few more minutes entirely manageable. Elara looked at the floor. She thought about the wagon and the road and counting stars. She thought about her father's voice going thin at the edges. Without deciding to, her throat opened and a sound came through it, low, wavering, uncertain as a candle in wind. Maren turned away. Elara stopped. "I'm sorry, is it? Was that wrong?" The old woman did not answer immediately. Her shoulders had a particular quality of stillness. the kind that preceded motion rather than settling after it. When she finally turned back, her eyes were red along the lower lids. "I heard that voice once," she said, 20 years ago, in a cottage south of the Ironway Road." She stopped, pressed the bent finger of her left hand briefly against the corner of her mouth. "Your mother sang you into your first sleep in this world. I was there. I heard it." The chapel held them both very quietly. Elara's throat ached with something she couldn't name. It moved through her chest like the echo of a door closing. Grief, or its reverse, some feeling that existed in the same cavity grief, used but moved in the opposite direction. "I'll teach you," Marin said. Everything she would have. The first private meeting happened on the 5th day. Gareth came to her door, large, serious, with the scarred hands of someone who had earned his position in the old way, and said that the king requested her presence in the small receiving room when she was ready, and that there was no urgency, and that the "when you are ready" was genuine rather than formal. She went in her own clothes. The room was upsided with warmth, panelled in dark wood, 2 chairs angled toward a fire that was burning lower than it had any right to at this hour, a small table between them with a cup of wine already poured. The king was sitting in one of the chairs, not the larger one, with one boot braced against the hearthstone, and a small piece of wood turning slowly in his hand. He was using a short knife on it, unhurried, the curl of a shaving drifting to the floor. He looked up when she came in. Not startled. He had heard her approach, she was sure of it, but with the quality of attention of someone setting aside a task willingly rather than being interrupted. "Sit down," he said, "and then, please." She sat. He put the carving down on his knee and leaned back. In this light, firelight only, no candle, she could see him more clearly than the hall had allowed. He was younger than she had expected a king to be. The grey in his eyes was warmer than it had seemed in the corridor, more the colour of morning ice than winter stone. His jaw held the shadow of several days' neglect. The scar on his left eyebrow was very visible here. "I want to explain something," he said, "before someone else does it in a way I won't like." She folded her hands in her lap and waited. 7 years ago," he said, "there was a patrol on the Thornvale border road. I was on it. We were attacked. I was separated in the storm. Arrow through the shoulder, couldn't shift." He turned the piece of wood over in his hands. "I went down in a snowfield. I had decided by that point that I was going to die there. I was rational about it. It seemed like the most likely outcome." He paused. She watched a shaving curl off the edge of the wood. "And then there was a child, a girl. She could not have been more than 10 or 11. She was wearing a coat several sizes too large, and she had lost her hat somewhere, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who had encountered an unacceptable problem and intended to solve it." A pause. "She asked me if I could crawl." Elara's breathing changed. She was suddenly aware of the exact pressure of her hands against each other. The smell of pine resin and cold stone, the memory of a coat that dragged in the snow, and a man whose face she hadn't been able to see because it was dark, and because he was very, very pale, and she had been mostly focused on his hands, checking for pulse, checking for cold, the way her father had taught her. "I could crawl," he continued. "She pulled what she couldn't carry. We reached a shepherd's hut, barely, and she built a fire with frozen fingers, and she fed me bread, and she sat approximately 2 feet away from me, and she sang." He stopped. "She sang all night. She didn't ask my name. She didn't seem to care who I was. She seemed to care only that I was a person who was dying, and that this was unacceptable." He looked at her directly. By morning the fever had broken, and she was gone. She had left her coat over me. The fire made a small sound, settling. Elara thought about the coat. She had grieved that coat for weeks. It had belonged to her mother, retrieved from a trunk the winter before, the first thing of Lyanna's she had ever held. She had not understood why she'd left it, only that she hadn't been able to make herself take it back from the man who was still sleeping. He had looked, in the grey dawn, so young and so breakable. She looked at the scar on his eyebrow. "The picture," she said. Her voice came out very even, as if from a distance. "There was a broken pitcher on the floor. A shard of it was. It was in your brow, bleeding into your eye. I took it out with my fingers." He went completely still. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I didn't know your name. The shards were there, and the blood was getting into your eye, and you were going to be very uncomfortable when you woke up if I left them." A long silence. "You remembered the picture," he said, very quiet. "I remembered the picture." She looked up. "I didn't know it was you." The fire shifted again. The wood popped once and subsided. Without thinking, without anything so deliberate as a decision, she lifted her hand and touched the scar. Just the tip of one finger, resting against the pale seam above his left eyebrow, testing whether it was real, whether the architecture of memory and present could actually inhabit the same body. He did not move. She could feel his pulse through the thin skin there, or thought she could. It might have been her own, traveling up through her fingertips. She pulled her hand back. "I'm sorry." "Don't." His voice had dropped by half a register. He was not looking away. "Don't apologize for that." She looked at her own hand, at the tip of the finger that had touched him, and felt the warmth still in it, as if she'd held something living. After a moment, he reached down beside his chair and picked up a small carved figure. A wolf, no longer than her thumb, roughed out of pale wood with grain lines running along the flank that looked almost like fur in the right light. He held it out to her. She took it, turning it in her fingers. "I carve one each year," he said. "I don't always know who they're for when I start. I've given away 6. A pause. The 7th, I knew." She set the wolf on her palm and looked at it for a long time. "I'll stay," she said. Finn arrived the following morning with bread and an entirely unnecessary amount of conversation. He was 8 years old and apparently believed in the value of information transfer above all other social courtesies. He told her the name of every horse in the stable, the correct way to address a territorial dispute between 2 of the keep's hunting dogs, and 3 separate theories he had developed about why Ghost had chosen her room specifically, each more elaborate than the last. Then he stopped, tilted his head and said, "Are you going to stay?" She blinked. "The king is hoping," Finn said, with the frank delivery of someone who had not yet learned to soften useful information. Then he turned and ran before she could say a word. She looked at the doorway where he'd been, then down at Ghost, who had the expression of an animal entirely uninvested in human drama. The wolf carving was sitting on the windowsill. She had put it there last night, and then found herself looking at it every time she crossed the room. She had grown up in a house with 3 older sisters, and a father who watched her with a kind of helpless tenderness that the others had noticed and resented. She had grown up invisible in the way youngest children were invisible, passed over for decisions, excluded from plans, addressed in diminutives. When you were the family's least strategic asset, when you had no land portion of your own, and a gift no one understood, you learned to take up as little space as possible. She was still learning what it meant that someone had been looking for her. The training with Marin began on the 6th day, and within a week, the shape of what she was began to clarify, the way a figure clarified in fog, not all at once, but feature by feature, each session adding detail. The first gift, slowing. Her voice, aimed with intention, could arrest motion. Not stop it entirely. Momentum was stubborn, but delay it, draw out the arc of a flying object by fractions of seconds that could be the difference between impact and passage. The second gift, waking. The fever song she had used on Caelan as a child, the same song her mother had used on her. Heat drawing, Maren called it. The body's temperature, caught between a voice and its target, moved toward equilibrium. The third gift, breaking. A long low note, held past the point of comfort, disrupted certain metals. Silver, specifically. Silver shackles, silver locks. Maren demonstrated on a decorative chain, and Elara watched the links separate one by one, quietly, like a sentence running out of words. There is always a cost, Maren told her. Remember that. The voice pulls from somewhere. Use it too long, and you won't have it back for days. Use it once more after that, and you may not have it back at all. Elara practiced until her throat ached, and then rested, and then practiced again, and Ghost sat in the corner of the practice room and watched with steady silver eyes. The rainstorm arrived on the 9th evening without warning, the way northern weather had of being impatient. They had been walking the upper garden, not by design, simply because the path of after-dinner conversation had drifted them there, the way water drifted to the lowest available surface. It had become a habit neither of them had named, these post-supper walks along the parapet wall, the keeps of ashen veil laid out below in lit window. He talked easily, more easily than she'd expected from someone with a reputation for silence. He had questions he asked once, and then didn't repeat, and opinions he offered without pressing them on her, and a way of laughing, infrequently, but really, that had a note in it like something unlocking. She had not yet told him this. The sky had been clear when they came up. By the time they reached the far end of the garden, the sky was not clear at all, a solid grey mass rolling in from the northwest with the particular efficiency of a storm that meant business. He looked up, then at her, with the expression of a man calculating options and finding none of them particularly dignified. The first drop hit the flagstone between them. Then the second. Then the sky opened. There was no roof near enough. Elara stood in the sudden cold weight of it and felt the absurdity of the situation move through her chest like a bubble. This formal man in his linen shirt, the shackle marks still faded on her wrists, standing in the exact center of a medieval parapet in an absolute downpour, and then she was laughing. Not politely, not carefully. A real laugh, starting somewhere in her sternum and coming out before she could catch it. The kind of laugh that felt embarrassing a moment after, but not a moment before. She didn't look at him right away. She tipped her head back and let the rain hit her face and laughed at the sky, because it was better than the alternative, and the alternative had been following her around for weeks. When she finally looked over, he wasn't laughing. He was watching her. There was no other word for it, not glancing, not looking, watching, with the full specific attention of someone who had stopped in the middle of a motion and found they didn't want to complete it. The rain was in his hair. His shirt was soaked through. His eyes in the rain light were darker than usual. The gray turned to the color of storm itself. She stopped laughing. They stood facing each other, the rain connecting them like a third party in the conversation, and neither of them spoke. He extended his hand. Not to tears. Palm turned upward, simply offered. A question with no words attached. She looked at it, at the calloused flat of his palm, rain pooling in the cup of it, the long fingers she had watched carve small wolves out of pale wood. She placed her hand in his. They walked inside, through the courtyard, under stone arches, water streaming from both of them. Their hands remained linked until the inner door, and then they stood in the dry, torchlit corridor, dripping, and looked at each other, and Elara felt the warmth of his hand still in her palm like something cupped and carried, something she had to be careful not to spill. Neither of them mentioned it. Both of them thought about it for a long time afterward. She found the histories of the Vale Singers in the 3rd week, on a shelf so high it required the tallest ladder in the royal library, and she did not come down again for several hours. The library was large enough to get lost in, which she did with increasing frequency, and warm enough at night that the stone wall at the back functioned as a substitute for something resembling comfort. She had brought a candle. Ghost had presumably gone to sleep, somewhere sensible. The book was enormous and dry, and thoroughly fascinating, and she was, without intending it, asleep with her cheek against the open page by the 11th hour. She heard the door. Not fully. She was still mostly in the warm grey country that lay between sleep and waking, where sounds had shapes but not meanings. Steps, unhurried, the particular quality of someone moving in the dark from long practice, not needing the room's geography spelled out in the light. Something settled over her shoulders, heavy, warm, smelling of leather and pine, and something that was specifically him. She would not have been able to say how she knew that, only that she did, the way you knew your own house in the dark. "Gareth," she said, mostly to the table. "No, I'll." She opened her eyes. He was crouching at her height, the King of Ironmere on his heels in the dark royal library, hand still on the edge of the coat he'd laid over her. His face in the dim candlelight was very close, and his expression, patient, careful, something else that she could not name in the low light and her own half-woken state, stayed on her without shifting. She reached out, in the way of someone not yet fully awake, and closed her hand around his wrist. "Don't go," she said. She felt him go very still. She felt that she should probably have said something else, or nothing at all, but the hand that was holding his wrist had made a decision of its own, and she was tired, in a way that had less to do with the hour than with everything that had come before it. And his wrist was warm, and his pulse was steady, and she was, she realized, not afraid. He did not go. She heard him sit down, not in a chair, on the floor, back against the leg of her chair, the way someone settled in for a long watch. Ghost appeared from wherever he'd been and lay across his feet with the certainty of an animal that knew a fixed point when it found one. She slept. When she woke in the grey morning light, the fire had gone to coals, and he had gone to wherever kings went at first light, and his coat was still around her shoulders, still warm, still holding that smell of leather and pine that she could not think about directly, or it became too specific a feeling. She wore it for 3 days before she thought to return it. She wore it for 6 before she actually did. "What do you look like?" They were in the upper garden, early morning, the 14th day. She had not planned the question. It had simply been waiting in her, the way questions did when you'd been curious about something long enough that you'd gone past the point of choosing not to ask. He turned to look at her. "As a wolf," she clarified, and felt the heat move into her face for having asked at all. "I'm sorry, you don't have to howl." "Why do you want to know?" She considered this honestly. "I don't know. It seems like something I should know about you." The pause that followed was longer than most of his pauses, which were already longer than other people's. He looked at the garden wall for a moment. A muscle at the side of his jaw moved. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "The south yard. Come before anyone else is awake." The south yard at dawn was the color of pale ash, frost on the flagstones, the sky that particular shade of early winter blue that held no warmth but had a beauty like cut glass. He was already there when she arrived, coat in hand. He held the coat out to her without speaking. She took it and held it and watched. He turned, and the change was not violent, not the way the old stories described, not a breaking apart and remaking. It was more like a translation. The man who stood in the early light shifted through something that was neither one thing nor the other, and then the wolf was there, and he was very low. White silver, big enough that her eyes kept trying to reclassify him as something else. His eyes in this form were the same exact gray as his eyes in the other, the same specific color, winter ice over deep water. He sat in front of her and did not move. She walked forward. She placed her hand on his shoulder and felt the muscle beneath the thick fur, the heat radiating up through it, the slow, enormous breath that moved his whole body. She moved her fingers up toward his left shoulder. There. The fur grew in slightly wrong there, a swirl in the grain of it, thinner, as if the follicles had healed imperfectly. A wide scatter of it, the size and shape of a wound from 7 years ago. Her hand stopped. She kept it there for a moment, palm flat against the healed place, and felt the wolf go very still and very quiet beneath her. "I see it," she said, very softly. "I see where it was." When he shifted back, he was already looking at her. "You're not afraid," he said. "No. Go." She met his eyes. In the growing light, she could see everything his face wasn't doing, not performing composure, simply having it, the way stone didn't need to pretend not to be stone. Except this morning there was something in the stillness that was not as still as usual. "I'm afraid of many things," she said. "You're not one of them." He took his coat back. She thought he was going to say something, and he didn't, and she thought the fact that he didn't say it was somehow more information than if he had. Seraphine sat in the room as if the room was still hers to arrange. Elara had seen Gareth's restraint in the doorway, his careful positioning between the woman and the exit, and had understood that he was offering her a choice. She could let him handle it, or she could go in. She had handed him her cloak and gone in. The table between them was bare. Seraphine had dressed for an audience, which told Elara she had expected negotiation, had expected to offer something in exchange for something. She had not expected to find her youngest sister on the other side of the table, or to find that sister watching her with the quiet, specific attention of someone who had been listening carefully for a long time. "I want to understand one thing," Elara said, "before the formal record begins." Seraphine's expression was the careful neutrality of a woman buying time. "Then, ask it. Did you know who he was to me before you brought me here?" The silence had a quality. Seraphine's face did something that Elara had never seen it do in 20 years of living under the same roof. A very small, very brief dissolution of the mask, as if a seam had been tested. Then it was gone. "No. You didn't know. I knew you had some value to someone in Ironmere. I knew the debt was sufficient court." Her voice was still measured, but something underneath it had shifted. "I didn't know why he would want you specifically." "You sold me," Elara said, not knowing who I was to him. "You only knew I was worth something to someone, and you decided that was sufficient reason." The room held the word, sold the way stone held coal. Seraphine said nothing. "You told yourself," Elara continued, "that you were paying a debt, that it was practical, that I was the least necessary person in the equation." She watched her sister's face. "I think you believed that. I think you believed a great many things you didn't check first. You were always..." Seraphine stopped. I know what I was. Elara kept her voice entirely even. I know how Father looked at me. I know you kept 20 years of count on it. I understand that part. A pause. But you killed him, Seraphine, not the debt, you. The silence after that was a different quality entirely. Not strategic, not calculating. Simply present, the way a wound was present. The trial will be formal, Elara said, standing. Gareth has the records. I have nothing else I need from you. She walked to the door. Then, because there was one more thing, and she had earned the right to say it. When Father looked at me the way you couldn't stand, he was seeing Mother. I know that now. He was looking at her through me. She put her hand on the doorframe. You spent 20 years in competition with a ghost. That's not my fault. She left. In the corridor, she stopped and pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed through the shake in her hands until it passed. The cold of the stone against her spine was useful. Specific. Present. Tight. Gareth appeared at the end of the corridor and looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether to say something. Good, he said, and turned and walked away. They were in the upper garden on the evening of the 17th day when the stables caught fire. The first sound was wrong, not the specific wrongness of fire, but the absent wrongness of horses not making horse sounds when they should have been. Then the smell reached the garden wall, and she understood it before Caelan did, or perhaps at the same moment, because they both turned toward the south yard at once. The next minutes were the architecture of controlled emergency. Guards moving in the right directions, the alarm bell answering itself from 2 towers, Gareth's voice carrying through the noise with the precision of someone who had done this before. She was not supposed to be in the stable yard. She understood this, factually, and she was in the stable yard anyway, because Ghost had gone that direction, and she was following Ghost, and there was a man at the far corner of the yard who did not belong to the keep's colors. Then there was a man raising a crossbow. She wasn't thinking. She sang. A single drawn note, mid-range, pulled from the back of her throat the way Marin had taught her. Not forced, not shrieked, simply opened fully, and she felt it land against the bolt in flight the way a hand landed against a rolling object, not stopping it but bending its arc, pulling it down, and it buried itself in the yard post 3 feet short of its target. Her throat ached immediately. Ghost was fine. The man was not, once Gareth arrived 11 seconds later. The fighting lasted another 20 minutes that she spent inside the gate with her back to a wall, which was probably where she should have stayed from the beginning. When it was over, when the men in wrong colors had been removed from the premises by various means, she found herself standing in the small receiving room, in front of the low fire, with her hands finally starting to shake properly, which was apparently what hands did when they were no longer needed for anything useful. Caelan came in. She saw the sleeve of his shirt before she saw his face. The dark fabric darker down the left arm, wet in the way fabric was wet when something other than water had gotten into it. Your arm, she said. It's... Sit down. He looked at her. She looked back. He sat down. She found the medical box Marin kept in the room. Water, cloths, clean thread if it needed it. She pulled a chair in front of his and sat, and looked at his arm, and found the edge of the cut, long, starting near the elbow, running to within a hand's width of the wrist. Not deep enough to have touched bone. Deep enough to have bled considerably into the dark linen. Roll up your sleeve, she said. He rolled it up with his other hand. The cut was still seeping, sluggish now. She pulled the bowl close, dipped the cloth, and began. He said nothing. She said nothing. The fire was low, and the room was otherwise quiet, and she worked by feel and the specific orange light, cleaning the wound with the focus of someone who had learned that tending to physical problems was a form of thinking. "Does it hurt?" she asked, without looking up. "No." The word was too immediate. She looked up. He was watching her face with an expression she had not encountered on him before. Not neutral, not careful, simply present. Open in a way that the careful architecture of him usually wasn't, as if the evening had worn through a layer of something. "It hurts," she said. "Yes." "Then, say so." She returned to the wound. Her hands were steady in the way they'd been in the library. The shaking had stopped somewhere between the garden and here, leaving her with a focused stillness she recognized from the hours spent with Moraine. The state that came when everything extraneous had burned off, and she was only what was necessary. She began the bandage. The cloth strips were narrow, and she had to wrap them with care, passing the roll under his arm and back over the top, each pass bringing her hands against his forearm for the fraction of a second before she lifted away and repeated the motion. She could feel the warmth of him clearly, not feverish, simply constitutionally warm, the same warmth she had felt in the courtyard in the rain. He was not breathing normally. She could hear it, or rather, she could hear when the rhythm changed, when the inhale was slightly slower than it had been, when the exhale waited a beat longer. She didn't look up. She kept rapping. She tied off the last knot with both hands, her fingers resting for a moment on the inside of his wrist, where the pulse lived close to the surface. She looked up. He was very close. She had not been aware, while working, of how close they had drifted, how far she had leaned forward to see the wound, how far he had inclined toward the light. The distance between them was a hand's width. His eyes in the firelight were the color of deep winter, and they were on her with that unguarded openness she had seen for the first time 60 seconds ago, and had not yet found a word for. "Done," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Thank you." He didn't look away. She didn't pull her hands back. The moment extended itself with a kind of patience, as if it understood something they hadn't admitted yet, and had decided to simply hold the space and wait. Ghost jumped onto her lap. She startled backward. He exhaled, something between a breath and a laugh, genuine, slightly broken at the edges. And she found herself laughing too, quietly at the wolf pup who had arrived exactly where he was not needed, and was now turning in a circle on her legs with the satisfaction of a problem solved. But when she looked up again, she saw what remained on his face after the laughter faded, something quiet and warm and utterly specific, and she understood that whatever had been at room between them was not gone. It had simply moved somewhere more patient, somewhere that intended to wait. "My love," he said. The words were without theater, without self-consciousness. Not a title, not a performance. Simply the words that fit. "Say that again," she said. "My love." His voice was low and steady and entirely certain. She folded her hands in her lap and did not look away. Ghost was warm and heavy against her legs. The fire shifted and resettled. She kept the words in her chest for a while, where they did something particular to her breathing. 3 days later, he stood before her in the receiving room and said, "I need to tell you something, before I tell everyone else." She waited. "I've been in love with the idea of you for 7 years, he said. "I know that's not a normal thing to say to a person you've known for 3 weeks. "It's not," she agreed. "I know." He crossed his arms, uncrossed them, crossed them again, which she had learned meant he was uncomfortable, which meant the words were true rather than prepared. I didn't know who you were. I only knew a voice and a pair of very small hands, and the decision you made to stay up all night to keep someone alive who wasn't related to you and wasn't offering you anything in return." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't fall in love with you 3 weeks ago, Elara. I fell in love with you 7 years ago, with a girl I'd never met, because of what she chose to do with a night she could have spent differently." She stood very still. "I want to be honest about that," he said. "I'm not asking you to match it. I'm aware that you've had approximately 3 weeks to develop any feeling whatsoever, and that I am coming into this conversation with a significant head start, and that's not fair. I'm telling you because you should know, not because it creates an obligation. The song," she said, "that I sang you, it was the only song I knew from my mother. She used to hum it before she disappeared. It was the only thing I had from her." He said nothing. "I gave you the only thing I had from her," she said, "and then you kept it for 7 years. The fire made the room very warm." She crossed the distance between them and placed her hand flat on his chest. She could feel his heart beneath her palm, not steady, not even remotely steady, considerably less steady than the man's general composure had led her to expect. She found that she trusted the heartbeat more than the composure. "I don't know," she said, "exactly what this is yet, what I feel." She kept her hand where it was. "But I know it's been growing since the corridor, and I know it's not nothing, and I know that I wore your coat for 6 days because I didn't want to stop having it near me." She looked up at him. "That's what I have right now. I'm telling you because you should know." He covered her hand with his own. The sound in the room was just the fire, and their breathing, and the very small sound of something settling into place. "May I?" he started. "Yes." He cupped her face in both hands. His palms were warm. Warm in the way of someone who ran at a higher temperature. Warm in the way she had come to recognize as his specific warmth, different from other warmths. He held her face with a carefulness that she felt in her chest as something being kept safe, and he looked at her for one long moment before he bent and kissed her. It was not a claiming. It was the way you set something down after carrying it for a long time, with relief and with intention, and with the specific care of placing something valuable on a surface that would hold it. When he lifted his head, his forehead settled against hers. They stood that way and breathed. 7 years, she said. 7 years. She felt the shape of it. All that time, all those winters. A man carving small wolves out of pale wood and not knowing why, searching in the wrong faces for the right one. A girl growing up, invisible, in her own house, not knowing she had been looked for. 2 lives moving in parallel for years, until someone's jealousy and an old iron debt had placed them, against all probability, in the same corridor. "Next time," she said, "don't take so long." He laughed. She felt it against her hair, the real laugh, the unlocking one, the rare kind that she had learned to recognize as the most honest thing about him. She stored the sound of it in the same place she stored the warmth of his hands. The formal proceedings against Seraphine lasted 3 days. Gareth presented the records from Varental, the timber accounts, the bank transfers, the letters in Seraphine's own hand arranging the sale of a Veilsinger to the Lord of Ashenmore, the correspondence with Varric that predated Edric Voss's death by 11 months. The Lords of Ironmere listened with the gravity of men who understood the weight of written evidence, and found it satisfying to have it presented clearly. Rowena wept and said she had known nothing, and said it to a room full of people who had read the same letters and knew better. But Elara had said, privately to Gareth, that 3 years in the southern convent was sufficient. She did not say it from mercy exactly. She said it because she was tired of Rowena, and the convent was far away. Seraphine said nothing during the reading of the charges. She sat straight-backed and pale, and looked at some point on the far wall, and did not look at Elara once. "Seraphine of House Voss," Caelan said, from the throne, in the voice that carried without being raised, "you are sentenced to exile at the Outer Isles for the term of your natural life. The name Voss is hereafter forfeit to you. You leave this hall as Seraphine, simply." A pause. No appeal will be heard. Elara sat in the chair at the left of the dais where Gareth had placed her and watched the woman who had kept a 20-year count on every look her father had given his youngest daughter, and felt the thing that occupied her chest in that moment. Not satisfaction, not grief, not triumph. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing, not slamming. The feeling of a story completing its last sentence. "You spent 20 years in competition with a ghost," she had said. "That's not my fault." She still believed it. Isolde came to find her after. She was 16 and tried to appear composed and achieved it for approximately 11 seconds before her face did what it did when she had been holding something too long, and then she was crying, not quietly, not delicately, the hard kind of crying that had nowhere graceful to go. Elara sat down beside her on the stone bench outside the hall. She didn't reach out immediately, just sat, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, while Isolde worked through it. "I thought," Isolde said, when she had breath to say things, "that you would never forgive me for not telling you sooner, for not you." "You were 16, Elara said. "I am 16. "Yes." Elara looked at her sister, the thin shoulders, the hands pressed flat against her own knees, the red hair that had come from some ancestor neither of them had met. "You were the only person who tried. You just had to do it quietly, in a letter I almost didn't find." Isolde leaned sideways and put her head on Elara's shoulder. They sat there while the hall behind them returned to its ordinary noise, while Ghost appeared from around the corner and dropped onto Elara's feet, while the winter light moved across the courtyard stones in its particular slow way. "Stay," Elara said. "Marin will teach you if you want to learn. There are worse places to be 16 than here." Isolde was quiet for a while. "Is he good to you?" she asked finally. The question was careful, precise. The question of someone who had grown up watching arrangements made between houses and knew to be suspicious of arrangements. Elara thought about his coat, still warm in the morning light. The way he had stayed on the library floor until dawn. The scar she had made with a pitcher shard and his palm held out in the rain. "Yes," she said. They married in the upper garden on a morning in late winter, when the frost was still on the stones, and the old tree at the garden's center had exactly 2 green shoots on its lower branches that could be taken as either stubbornness or hope. There were 9 people present. This was not because they couldn't have filled the hall. The hall would have been glad of it. But because Elara had said, when asked, that she would prefer something smaller, and Caelan had said, without pause, then smaller. Gareth was there. Marin was there. Isolde stood at Elara's shoulder and held Ghost when he tried to interfere with the ceremony. Finn stood slightly apart with the focused expression of a child who understood the importance of the occasion and intended to observe it properly. They used a strip of grey wool, the old way, wound around their joined hands, pinned with a wolf head clasp from the keep's older armory. Marin spoke the words. The tree stood over them, and the sky held its winter blue, and Ghost made one attempt to join the ceremony and was intercepted. Before the cloth was wound, before Marin began, Caelan looked at her with the expression she had come to know was what he looked like when he intended to be accurate, not performed, not rehearsed, simply the face of a man choosing to say the true thing. "I carved 7 wolves in 7 years," he said. keeping his voice low, just for her. Not because I was hopeful, because I didn't know what else to do with all that time. He reached into his coat pocket with his free hand and held out the seventh wolf, the small, pale carving she had set on his windowsill and then kept on her own. I gave it to you the first week because it was yours. It was always yours. I just needed you to get here to find out. She took it from him, turned it in her fingers once. Then she placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. It was always yours too, she said. I just needed you to give it to me so I could give it back. He looked at the wolf in his fist. His jaw moved in a way she had learned meant he was working against something that might otherwise show too clearly. Good, she thought. Let it show. Maren said the word. The cloth went around their hands. That night, in the room with the real window and the bolt thrown from inside, she lay with her head on his chest and listened to his heart, that particular rhythm, faster than it should have been for a man at rest, that she had learned meant something different than exertion. The wolf carving sat on the windowsill. Outside, the frost was doing what frost did to winter stones, covering them in something that would thaw come morning, leaving nothing permanent, only the brief evidence of a cold night and a warm interior. She thought about all the shapes a life could take, the shape where Isolde had not tucked that letter into the bottom of the sack, the shape where the fairy had left before she did, and she had never arrived, the shape where he had been facing the other direction in the corridor and had not heard. She thought about the particular foolishness of the shape that had actually happened, a jealous sister, an old debt, an iron road north, a song she hadn't known she was singing. There is a kind of love, she thought, that comes after a death, of a person, of a life, of the story you thought you were living. No one tells you about that kind. They tell you about the first kind, the bright kind, the kind that arrives with its flags flying. They don't tell you about the kind that finds you in the wreckage and simply stays, the kind that was looking for you before you knew you were lost. His hand moved in her hair, once, a slow pass, the way you touched something you weren't taking for granted. She closed her eyes. Outside the keep, the wolves were running. You could hear them, if you were quiet enough, the sound they made in snow, the particular music of animals covering ground freely, going where they chose. She had learned, in the last weeks, that she could hear them. She listened for a while. Then she slept.